Welcome to the first installment of NSBP Vision Series, where we invite you into the conversations of seasoned physicists and thought leaders, science and/or technology. We hope that through these conversations, NSBP members can explore their research ideas, broaden their interests, and network with professionals. With that, I would like to introduce the president of the National Society of Black Physicists, Professor Stefan Alexander.
Thank you so much, Farah. Yes, I'm really excited about NSBP Vision precisely because we intend to bring science to the people. We intend to have crosstalk amongst thought leaders and our young emerging NSBP scientists and students and professionals so that we can dream together and bring science to the people. And so on that note, it's a real pleasure to have LaNell Williams, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard University in the physics department. She studies biophysics and soft condensed matter physics. LaNell originally is from Memphis, Tennessee, and her research focuses on virus self-assembly. And we're gonna learn a lot about that today, as it's very relevant given the crisis that we're in, the pandemic that we're in. She's currently on the APS Council of Representatives, representing a forum of graduate students and early careers. And she's also a leader at NSBP. She currently serves on the Student Council for the National Society of Black Physicists. And she's also the founder of Women Plus of Color Project. Our next special guest is Duane Valz. Duane is currently the Vice President and General Counsel of Incitro, which is a machine learning driven drug development company located in the Bay Area. And prior to that, Duane was the general counsel of Zymergen, another machine learning biotech crossover company. Duane has had a long career as an IP, intellectual property counsel in Silicon Valley, holding executive positions at Google and Yahoo. And Duane is originally from Guyana, South America, and grew up in New York City, like myself, where he attended Stuyvesant High School. Unlike myself, I attended DeWitt Clinton High School. And Duane went on to UC Berkeley for undergraduate studies and remained to attend Berkeley Law School. He is acknowledged as one of the world's leading intellectual property strategists and supports a number of initiatives directed to increasing underrepresented students in STEM education and career, such as smash.org. And he's also a big supporter of the National Society of Black Physicists. So it's a great pleasure to have both LaNell and Duane engage in conversation across the intersection of biophysics, research biophysics on one end, and intellectual property strategies, and also in the private sector. So the first question, I'm just gonna shoot off with a question for both of you, which is, what are you both excited about, and why is it relevant in terms of both of your fields, and how is it relevant to some issues that we may be facing today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks to the National Society of Black Physicists, and thanks to you, Dr. Alexander, for organizing this series. And I'm delighted to be able to participate. Some things that excite me are some of the things that got me into my current field. And obviously we're dealing with a global pandemic, with a virus that's very tricky to contain. And many folks are racing to address the disease of COVID-19. Working in biotech, it's clear that biology is strange. There's a lot we understand about it. There's a lot we understand about genetics, but there's still a lot that defies rational analysis. And so being in a position at a company that's bringing an engineering type discipline to biology, it provides some great opportunities to really address both COVID and other diseases that afflict people the world over.
Thank you, Duane. LaNell?
Yes, I guess I can start by saying that I am very interested in, it's interesting the umbrella that we're under right now, the COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with, and also the pandemic of racism that's been brought to light by the BLM movement. It's exciting for me to think about research, especially because I'm a physicist who's also trying to understand the way that viruses work. Historically, a lot of research has been invested in attempting to get rid of viruses and attempting to eradicate them through vaccines and other methods. But a lot of my research is very based in the fundamentals of physics and trying to understand how viruses work and what they are, so we can better come up with solutions, hopefully, to deal with them in the future. Under this pandemic, as a Black woman, as a Black physicist, I am also affected by the BLM movement and have invested a lot of my time in attempting to help other students and help other folks who are also interested in science and STEM under this movement, because we're also affected by the things that happened around us. I'm not just a Black physicist in my department at Harvard. I'm also a Black person once I leave that department. And so for me, those are the two things that have been weighing on my heart over this sort of double pandemic that we have currently.
So that's interesting, LaNell. I mentioned that one of the things that excites me about the work that I'm doing these days with In Sitro is bringing an engineering type discipline to the investigation of biology, specifically bringing machine learning. And it sounds like your work in understanding the biophysics of viruses is attempting to do the same thing. So it'd be interesting to hear more about the biophysical angle on understanding viruses.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I guess I can start by explaining what a virus is in the first place. So viruses in general are some of the deadliest organisms on our planet, and they're extremely efficient. A single virus can essentially infect one cell and then go off and infect 1,000 more viruses. 1,000 more viruses are made, and then they can go off and infect 1,000 more cells in a matter of hours. And you can imagine how efficient, viruses would be if, say, for instance, they were aliens. They could easily come to our planet and take over our planet, and then go off in a few weeks, to go off to infect other planets in our solar system in a matter of weeks. And then we'd end up with millions and trillions more, viruses or aliens or aircrafts that go off and take over other galaxies. Like, that's how powerful these organisms are. And they're extremely interesting. Their structure is interesting. Many of them tend to be spherical. Many of them tend to be very simple or rod-like. But as they get bigger, they get more complex and more complicated, and they find other ways to kind of get into our bodies and sort of evade our immune systems. And so the gist of my research is kind of focused on getting to know them, getting to know why they have these structures, getting to know how they assemble themselves. And that's probably essentially the number one thing we're focused on. And in many ways, we can find ways to use some of that very basic foundational knowledge to come up with engineering techniques to either assemble them or disassemble them.
So, but wait a minute. So viruses, I understand how they can be dangerous and how they proliferate, but there are these microscopic organisms, if we can even call them that, made of a little protein and fat. What does physics have to do with it?
Physics actually has a lot to do with it. When you think about, so if I said that I wanted to shoot a laser at nanoparticles, in many folks' minds, they would immediately think physics, right? The only difference between me and another physicist is that now I'm shooting lasers at a biological system. Now I'm shooting lasers at viruses. I'm trying to understand the dynamics of viruses, trying to understand the way that they sort of unfold and fold back together. I'm trying to better understand their structures. My lab in particular studies the MS2 virus, which is, you can think about it like a soccer ball in a way, right? And that soccer ball is made up of many different parts. And so originally those parts are just floating around randomly. So if you imagine a soccer ball and you just cut it up into a few pieces, right? And they're floating around randomly. How do those random parts, begin to create that sphere, create that circle that surrounds the RNA of the virus? And there's a lot of physics there. It's very, very hard to do. I would encourage anyone, if they want to try this, take a nice, cute little globe at home and put some beads in it. Keep shaking it around and see if you can make a spear or a virus. It's almost impossible, and that's where the physics comes in. The physics comes in with better understanding how we go from a bunch of random parts to assembling into a structure, assembling into something that needs no external force or external assistance to even come to being. And so that's what's fascinating about it. And this process actually describes what we call self-assembly. And self-assembly is we're trying to understand the physics of self-assembly, the sort of principles of self-assembly that govern each part of the viruses to each piece of the virus to actually come together. And so it would be very, very interesting. I'm sorry, I'll let you speak, but.
No worries. Yeah, so I mean, all life starts small and continues to grow and assemble the materials that each life form needs. What's different about viruses? Why is that an interesting facet about how viruses operate?
So in nature, right, we really can't see what's going on when small viruses in particular infect their host and create more viruses. We really can't see that process happening. But we might be able to see that for larger viruses. Viruses are really, really small. But the reason why viruses are different is the fact that if you take a virus and you pull it apart, you don't give it a host, you don't give it anything. You take a virus that is nice and I guess healthy, and you pull it apart, you put it in a tube with buffer, and you throw in the two parts that make up a virus, which is essentially the protein and the RNA. You mix them in an Eppendorf tube, and out comes a virus again. How does that happen? They're random parts. That is why it's special, because a virus doesn't necessarily grow into a virus. If you take the virus and you take it apart, it will just assemble back together. And I actually also had a question as well. As I'm describing my research and I'm describing sort of where my interests are in terms of the foundational science, I'm very curious as to where you think physics, science, the computational sciences in general can really take drug delivery in medicine. I know that we're sort of in a phase where a lot of companies and a lot of folks are attempting to understand this, but I think in terms of the long term, what do you envision could possibly happen if we began to answer some of these questions using physics, using machine learning, using the basic science, and in terms of engineering and coming up with new ways to deal with diseases and viruses in medicine?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think some of these topics are interesting just because the understanding that we would get, the scientific understanding, would be intrinsically interesting. But of course, we like to have applied understanding. And the more I learn about different types of diseases and different therapies, it's clear to me that there are multiple points of attack, right? So if we take something like COVID-19, there's a race to develop a vaccine which would prevent vaccinated humans from being susceptible to the virus multiplying and making them sick in the first place. We're also trying to develop drugs that, if you do get infected, would prevent you from getting even sicker. And that represents two different ways of addressing the same problem. What I see for some of the work you're doing is if alongside a vaccine, we understood the mechanisms by which viruses self-assemble or replicate, and we're able to use that understanding to interrupt that process, that could open up a whole different line of therapeutic approaches to containing diseases, infectious diseases like COVID-19.
I'm also curious, one thing that I have noticed as someone who is more on the physics and virology side is that there tends to be a bit, I wouldn't say taboo, but a sort of fearfulness essentially with sort of doing the kinds of biological experiments that we do to understand other systems like bacteria, E. coli, et cetera, versus viruses. And I'm curious as to, on your side, industry, et cetera, why hasn't there sort of been like more of an investment in like research or like technologies to try to better understand viruses as a whole, or sort of better prepare, for instance, for these kinds of pandemics, et cetera. And I think that on the science side, we haven't necessarily done our job in investing all of the resources we can in understanding the science behind viruses. And I'm curious if there's something similar in the industry side, and why that might be.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It has a number of facets to it. Based on my understanding, some of it is economic and some of it is just based on sentiment and trends. The fact is there are a number of looming issues. COVID-19 is a virus born infectious disease. We have many diseases that are brought to us by bacteria. And there's a current crisis where we're running short of antibiotics, and the number of pathogenic bacteria is increasing, and the efficacy of existing antibiotics is going way down. So this is a looming health crisis around the world. Why isn't more resources put into it? Quite frankly, it's because antibiotics don't carry a lot of profit, and so a lot of the big players don't have as much incentive to put research dollars behind that. And it's, not because they don't care. They put a lot of investment into other types of diseases that are severe and that, might also bring a greater return. But, this issue is being highlighted on the virus side, where there are multiple types of coronaviruses. We're concerned that as our environment changes, we may see these once in a century pandemics become more frequent.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that we need to get way ahead of this problem because viruses and bacteria evolve quite quickly. On the sentiment and trends side, I think there's a lot of focus on cancer and genetically caused diseases. These are some tough nuts to crack, and there are a lot of very intensive diseases that have a severe impact on those who suffer from them that are worth addressing. But the marketplace isn't perfect, so arguably we should be investing more in investing in more angles of attack against infectious diseases like COVID-19 and those that are brought to us by bacteria.
Yeah, so I have a question for both of you. Given this pandemic and given what Duane just said, just about trends and like what resources go into supporting research, and especially in medical research, do you think that there's also going to be a trend for scientists who are normal, like a person like myself, who works in quantum gravity, now feeling pressure maybe to apply our intellectual resources at the very least into these other fields, into fields where, like, say, Farah is working on, or maybe people like Farah not just pursuing an academic career, but moving more into, industry. Just a thought out there.
We shouldn't think about it as pressure, but just opportunity. I have a great respect for basic research and the role that basic research plays. And, if we get into a dynamic where we're saying that our academic and research focused colleagues aren't doing enough, they should be doing more applied work, that's not necessarily a healthy dynamic. There's a lot of basic research that leads to practical applications without necessarily that being the motivation. But for those of our colleagues who want to consider, careers in industry and have some ideas, either they're doing research in biology or pharmacology or other related disciplines, or they're in physics or other fields or computational fields and want to have an impact. There's a tremendous opportunity now to dive in and to, look at how you can leverage your skills and interests towards some of these more pressing problems.
Yes, I agree with that, but I also will say that on the science, on the sort of basic research side, I've sort of seen this trend of even folks in condensed matter and optics attempting to, under the pandemic, find ways to either assist or shift their research that to things that are relevant to COVID-19 specifically. How long that will last, we're not sure. Like once a vaccine comes out, will everyone, just completely forget about it? Who knows? But I think one thing that we do have the potential of doing is sort of lobbying for this sort of need for basic research, especially now, this sort of need for investing in the sort of core of like our pipeline for technology and applied science, which is our basic research. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend an event by APS earlier in January to lobby for science. And so something that might end up happening is that more scientists may actually be, and I've kind of seen this myself, more scientists may actually get more involved politically as a result of this sort of COVID-19 pandemic and this sort of focus on investing in science, investing in this kind of research, investing in vaccines, et cetera, and investing in not just basic research, but also in industry as well. And I think that under this sort of space that we're in, we do have the opportunity to sort of lobby for both and not necessarily weigh one side over the other, because they're both extremely important. You need the folks who are figuring out the questions and answering the whys and the why nots, and you need the folks that are going to take that information and go and be able to come up with things that are applicable in our day-to-day lives. And that's something that needs to happen consistently and honestly can't really happen unless we have the support that we need. But it has been pretty interesting, especially to see the sort of push now for more scientists to kind of get involved politically, specifically in these kinds of things, in terms of lobbying and in terms of coming up with policies, in terms of, so I think that we went to kind of lobby for an increase in the NSF budget or budget scores for science, based off of, on the federal budget specifically. And I think basic scientific research makes up like 0.2% of the federal budget. So even if they wanted to, double that, it would probably be equivalent to, some fluctuation or uncertainty in their numbers. And we would probably be able to do more amazing things with twice the money that we have. But again, partly due to the political climate, it's hard to sort of lobby for those things. And we might see we might see an influx of more scientists going into politics and like running for office, in addition to folks going into industry and trying to do things that are more implied and trying to sort of shift their research towards pandemics like COVID-19 or other things that might happen in the future that will affect us in the immediate term.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, one of the things we see, in America these days, at least in government, is not enough, respect and support for science and science-based decision-making. I think industry is always going to be interested in cutting-edge science that will tend to support the development of new products and services. But what we're seeing in the current public health crisis is that you really need a partnership between government and the private sector to effectively contain something as widespread and intensive as COVID-19. And so I do think that initiatives that would not only get the government to invest more, but to embrace the results more and to use the results to enhance its capability to respond to these kinds of crises is really the right word, that's at a premium. And so all efforts to both enhance individual involvement in areas of research that deal with public health and disease, as well as to change the mindset around how the results of great research can be leveraged and promoted and used in decision making. Those are all worthwhile things to do.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard of, various companies, and I think we might have spoken about this before, like Google and Microsoft, that are beginning to sort of expand on this like sort of basic research idea, because you essentially need both. You need to be thinking about the 10, 20 years ahead, what could possibly be in addition to what's happening now. And I think that's something that we haven't necessarily invested enough in, specifically in terms of our government. And I think that hopefully there will be a shift after this. But yeah, we're living in very interesting times, and I think for me it became really real when members of my family and friends, and I kept continuing to hear the effects of COVID. When you hear these kinds of things happening, I think as a Black physicist who is sort of studying these things, and in addition to like seeing the effects of them sort of happen around you, it personally has kind of motivated me to sort of begin to think about these things as well, in terms of being able to see where my research currently applies in industry and could be applied in the future. And I think, again, many of us are kind of having that sort of revelation, especially as Black physicists in particular, because statistically, it's been hurting minority communities and low-income communities in particular. And the reasons why are very complex. They range from the sort of decisions by the government to the sort of current socioeconomic, crises that, exist within certain neighborhoods. And I think that there is a lot that can be done on behalf of scientists. Kind of what we're doing here today is a part of that in terms of trying to get the word out to folks about what's happening and how this might be affecting us as a community. And I would hope to see that as scientists, as engineers, as folks in the tech industry, we do a better job at building that bridge between like the communities themselves, our government itself, and like the science and the production. Because sometimes I feel like we can almost get lost in just the work, and like just the product, and not necessarily keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. The model of us, let's face it, and the media, of course, definitely represents us. We're often, as people of color, Black people, are consumers of science and technology, rather than, of course, playing a more and more important role of also being voices and producers. And what are your thoughts about that direction and making sure that we are also at the forefront? I mean, that's kind of what this Vision series is about, is to kind of, put out to the world that we are also the producers and innovators, and can also play a role in new directions and new innovations regarding, because, how science actually and how technology could impact, and how our community could also impact science and technology. What are your thoughts there?
We're people of color, Black people exist in all parts of society, and we're impacted in different ways. But, when we have a public health crisis, we get to see things like the folks who are most in harm's way, the frontline workers tend to be disproportionately people of color. And yet, when they become infected and sick, they are least likely to have access to testing and adequate health care. And so there's, the spectrum of underrepresented peoples, gets impacted in disproportionate ways. And that should be a clear wake-up call, if it wasn't already a conscious reality for many professionals, that it's not just enough to go and do good research, go and do good work, maybe get some quiet accolades for producing it, if some of the impact of that work won't be distributed evenly, particularly in an equitable way, to the people who might need it and people from your own community. And so, we have to think about producing science and the products of science and technology in a holistic way. It's critical that we get more people of color, more Black people involved in the production of science engineering, and other technical disciplines. We also need folks who have business acumen, legal acumen, and other professional skills to understand how to commercialize these products and good research results, and to folks who can operate in the political sphere to try to influence the dialogue, to make sure that to the extent that the public sector has a role to play through policymaking in how medicines and other products of science and technology get distributed in society in a fair and equitable way, that we're attending to some of those issues as well. I mean, this issue gets really deep. One of the things I'm thinking about in terms of the equity of science and technology is in medicine, is the fact that for a lot of genetic diseases, a lot of the samples that you have, the human samples, are very much biased towards people of Caucasian, Eurasian, European descent. And so if you're not able to study the genetic diversity, then you're not going to be able to develop medicines that are addressed to genetic diseases in a way that's equitable. We also know that in the field of machine learning, there's been more studies about bias that emerges based on data sets that you generate from the general public. This is most acute when you're doing things like analyzing chat feeds, which reflect, the biases and the mindsets of the folks who participate in, sort of social networking, et cetera. But, some of these biases can also creep in scientific research as well. If you, don't frame the hypothesis that you're going after in the right way, it would could lead you, in a wrong direction. So there are many layers to this in terms of how do we promote inclusion, how do we promote equity, and how do we avoid bias. But it's important to include folks in all parts of this conversation.
I agree. I would like to add one other thing. So we also have to deal with our history within the country. So we have to deal with the sort of history of the way that science and tech, science has sort of taken advantage of our community as well. Why many of us, you'll find many folks, especially down south, who are afraid of vaccines. You'll find many folks who are afraid of the new thing that's coming out that your doctor wants to try on you, partly because of things like the Tuskegee experiments, partly because of things like HeLa cells specifically. We're very familiar with that story. Essentially, taking a Black woman's cells who had cancer and, essentially keeping them and not necessarily giving credit to her or her family for who knows how long. The history of gynecology and the way that Black women were used historically as, specimen who didn't feel anything for that entire area of research in the beginning is something that I think that the Black community sort of holds on to. And so before we can even begin to think about, again, the next steps and thinking about equity. But in addition to that conversation, I also think we need to think deeply about how scientists, people in STEM can begin to reach out to those communities and rebuild that trust. And some of that starts with us, actually. Some of that starts with sort of creating these connections and creating almost an incubator, showing our faces more, being sort of present and around so that, I spend a lot of my time educating my family about, viruses and COVID and, the things they should look out for, et cetera. And so it's not solely on us, of course, but in terms of our ability to be able to reach out to the folks in our community and better educate them and keep them safe as well, we can be doing more amongst each other. Like you mentioned earlier, we need folks who are in business and politics and STEM, et cetera. And I almost imagine that one day we can get to a point where we do have a Black incubator where, you know, there's a scientist at the table, there's a politician at the table, a Black politician at the table, there's a Black businessman at the table, and we're coming up with concrete ways we could just kind of be able to come up with these plans and implement them along with our allies, along with the connections that we have, to kind of make some of these things happen in the future. But we do have to start with the sort of history that we have, and sort of, you know, bridge that's kind of been burned between science and medicine and the Black community.
Right, right. But, and that's interesting, LaNell, but I think that, you know, what are your thoughts, both of your thoughts about the fact that you're both leaders in your own, you know, in your own respective careers right now, at where you're both at in your careers, and that we should have leadership. We should be the leadership. So we can't be just talking about the scientific community and the distrust. If we are those very voices that are invested in our community, and you are the head of the department, so to speak, or you run the lab, and Duane's the vice president of a company. I mean, we are the emerging leadership, and of course we should hope to see more of that, and we can create more of that, so that we are in a position, right, to make those more correct decisions. Yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Yeah,
I completely agree. I think that I'm also including myself in this. I was speaking more, you know, generally, to say that, like, as a community, we should all be kind of thinking about the ways in which we can engage, essentially. You know, I'm a PhD student at Harvard, you know, and something that's almost impossible or not even thought of for someone that came from Memphis, Tennessee, you know, a city like mine, and from a community like mine. And so in many ways, you know, I attempt to, like, try to reach back and, like, try to, again, educate and be present in my community. But again, I agree with you, Stefan, that this requires, you know, that's a whole nother segment by itself about what do we do specifically. But this does require almost all of us thinking about, within our individual sort of positions, like, what can we be doing? Who can we be reaching out to? How can we be sort of, like, giving back, or giving, or, you know, sort of implementing ideas and working together. But I agree.
Sure. So it's easy if you are a professional in STEM to focus on the work that you have to do in the lab and all of the cerebral work that you have to do quietly. And, you know, with all of the pressures to publish and to keep up with research and to stay apace of your colleagues, it can sometimes be daunting to think about breaking out more time to engage in, you know, socially focused activities and advocacy activities. But in the beginning of the program, LaNell talked about the dual pandemic that we're facing, just some of the, you know, upheavals around race and race relations and abuse and discrimination that have been happening alongside COVID-19. That gave me a feeling of both pressure and opportunity that maybe at this stage in my career, I could and should be doing more. And I think it's important if you take time to look up and understand who else is out there who's quietly operating, doing good work, but maybe not seeking out the limelight, who might share the same interests, might have some complementary perspectives to bring to bear, and to, you know, to understand how you could connect and align with other professionals who have insights and sensibilities like you do, so we can collectively accomplish more. And so I think this is the beginning of hopefully an awakening that would allow us to get together as professionals in and around STEM fields that really have an opportunity to make a difference, and to understand all of the different ways in which we could bring that to bear, and to make sure that we can create a more inclusive and just future for people of color and Black people throughout society.
Yes, I think that, so to go back to what you were saying, I think that, yes, that's a start. I think the hardest part of this, though, is the sort of connections piece. So a lot of times we don't have necessarily a lot of centralized locations to kind of have these conversations across disciplines specifically, or sort of connections. I think one thing that NSBP has done a good job of in particular is like actually becoming sort of a bridge for these kinds of connections. But I don't think that every sort of industry or every sort of group is necessarily doing that. And so one thing that I would like to see, especially for organizations in particular, to do, especially when you're sort of on the side of being able to reach out to various connections or your various networks, to be making those connections like we kind of have today. But the hardest part of this is actually making those connections and bringing the right people to the table, in the way that we are kind of doing today, to actually have those conversations and implement those ideas. You know, it's very interesting because I don't think I've seen a sort of the level of collaboration I've seen in the scientific community across different fields and across different industries like I have during the COVID pandemic. In a way, you've seen like sort of the private sector involving itself more in sort of the public health sector, and you've seen, as I mentioned earlier, folks who are in other physics fields attempting to try to solve these kinds of issues from their specific angle. And I think that's something that I would hope to continue, because science has for a while been sort of done in a silo. So the chemists are the chemist, and the physicists are the physicist, and the biologists are the biologist. And I think that the sooner that we sort of figure out, not just within STEM, but also across these many disciplines, as we mentioned before, once we figure out how to sort of break down all of those individual silos and begin to work together, we'd be able to actually solve more of these problems, and be able to work at them a bit more efficiently. But I also have one more question that I've been kind of thinking about. I'm very curious as to what, specifically what Black scientists, Black physicists might be able to bring to industry in particular. It's something that, and I'm asking this question on purpose because I'm sort of reminded of Scalia's sort of comments about what a Black scientist will bring to physics in particular, and of course this physicist, you know, came back. But I'm curious as to what Black scientists, Black engineers, et cetera, might be able to bring to industry in particular.
Yeah, so, you know, earlier I mentioned that there is these issues of bias in machine learning, and selectivity bias in the genetic data sets that researchers get to work with. And while, you know, having someone of a certain hue or background isn't a panacea, I think particularly if someone in dialogue with other professionals, having a cross-disciplinary perspective, can really bring that to bear in their work, they're more likely to raise the awareness of their colleagues around these issues. They may have additional ideas about how best to address these types of issues as a matter of methodology. And, you know, for you know, me, a lot of this is, you can't do good science if you're doing bias science. And a lot of bias is inadvertent, right? People aren't necessarily trying to marginalize people of color in their data sets or in how they develop products, but they just may be overlooking certain things about their hypothesis formulation. It might take a little extra investment to get data sets that are more reflective of a broader cross-section of the population. You know, there are a lot of things that you need to think about before you can try to achieve equity. And so I think having, you know, informed professionals working across disciplines, informing each other, once they go out into the workplace, that, you know, they'll automatically have some additional perspectives to add, as long as they're creating that foundation of awareness for themselves.
Do you both feel satisfied with what you felt you wanted to say or needed to say? Or do you feel like there's maybe something else you both might want to ask each other or say in sort of a last round?
Yeah, I'll add, this. So LaNell, it was great to hear from you. I think your research, brings some exciting possibilities to how we investigate in infectious diseases and potentially how we help to arrest them. And I think that, area of self-assembly and how we may be able to upend viruses before they can really come in and do damage is very promising. So I wish you all the best with that in your continued studies in the area, and all the best in potentially developing some solutions that can be brought into the practical application space.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also want to say thank you so much for, having this conversation with me. I feel like speaking with you today, especially like has given me a bit more perspective as well from the industry side. I've begun to think about, more ways that as a scientist in particular, I could begin to at least bare minimum continue to keep that bridge between the two, between what's happening foundationally and what's happening in the sort of applied realm as well. One thing I didn't get to ask was kind of about your background and what sort of made you sort of choose to join in Citro, and if you had any advice for the folks like me who may be coming from a science background or a non-science background that might be useful or interesting, or maybe the top two things that you've learned sort of on your journey and being a part of the in Citro team.
Yeah, well, I, generally my interest in all things science and technology just, comes from who I am. I've always enjoyed the fields and have never wanted to shy away from them, and that was only reinforced in high school, attending Stuyvesant and since. And so, having been out and working in Silicon Valley since the late 90s, I've seen a lot of tremendous technology get developed. I've most of my career worked on the hardware, software, internet side, but I've always personally excelled and been the most fascinated by crossover industries, whether it's mobile computing or open source and proprietary software working together. All of the issues that present cutting edge matters to think about and to help organize. And the crossover between biology and computation is one of those areas. And I think, there have been different commentators who've called the 21st century the biotech century. And I'm really coming to see that come to life. And so for me, it was a tremendous opportunity. And I've thoroughly been enjoying my time at In Citro, just seeing how some of the professionals across disciplines at the top of their game are collaborating to bring additional insight to bear. And if you're an outsider, or you're looking for your first gig, it's tough to say, well, pick this startup because startups are inherently risky. It's funny, I've done the opposite. I've worked in more established companies throughout my career, but lately have, had the good fortune to work with more startups. I have enough of a foundation to do that. And I've also had the good fortune to put myself in a position to work with some of the premier entrepreneurs and the scientists and engineers that they employ towards finding, solutions for the future. So, that's been my path, and I'm always happy to connect with people who are, in the research community and thinking about things that they can do to share my experiences and some insights that might help them make decisions.
Well, on that wonderful note, I want to thank LaNell and Duane for your time and for engaging the people with your interest in ideas and conversation at the interface of two different fields. And this is exactly what NSBP Vision is intended to do. And so I ask you all out there in whatever land that you're engaged in this show to reach out to our website, nsbp.org. Check us out on our YouTube channel and if you want to learn more about Duane and LaNell, we'll definitely have links to them. And in the meantime, wishing you all well, and we'll see you all soon at the next NSBP Vision episode.